They just stopped for a bottle of water. But what happened next will leave you speechless. You'll never guess how this night ended. Watch until the end and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's really important to us. And don't forget to like and subscribe. It only gets crazier from here. The clang of steel echoed one last time through the nearly empty gym, followed by the low hum of a closing locker door. The hour was late, well past midnight, and the usual crowd of muscle-bound regulars had long since disappeared. Only two figures remained under the flickering fluorescent lights: Chuck Norris and Seagal. Both drenched in sweat, they stood by the free weights, catching their breath in a silence that carried the calm weight of experience. Chuck wiped his brow with the edge of his shirt and glanced sideways at Steven, who calmly folded a towel over his forearm. "Still think you're the king of wrist locks?" Chuck asked with a half-smile, nodding toward the sparring mats in the back. Steven raised an eyebrow but didn't look over. "I didn't hear you complain when you were the one hitting the mat." "Yeah, well," Chuck said, rolling his shoulder, "I'll let you have that one. You needed the ego boost." The banter was familiar, comfortable. These two men, icons in their own right, had shared decades of action, both on screen and in personal training. Tonight was supposed to be routine. A late-night session, one of many, followed by a drink and silence before bed. The city outside buzzed faintly beneath an overcast sky. The old streetlights blinked with dull orange persistence, their light stretching across cracked sidewalks and puddles of oil that shimmered faintly. Chuck grabbed his gym bag while Steven moved with calm precision, slipping his arms through his black coat. "Thirsty?" Chuck asked as they stepped into the near-empty parking lot. Their SUV sat alone beneath a dying light post, humming gently with residual heat. Steven nodded. "There's that 24-hour market 2 blocks down. Still open?" "Always is," Chuck replied, unlocking the doors with a click. "You buying?" Steven's face remained neutral. "If I pay, you admit I tapped you out twice." Chuck's laugh echoed lightly in the night air. "Dream on." They drove in silence, the kind only shared between men who didn't need words to fill time. The streets passed like ghosts. Shuttered shops, closed diners, a sleeping city under a tired moon. When the store appeared, its neon sign flickered like a signal from another time. Half-lit, nearly empty, it looked like every late-night corner store in every small town. They pulled in close and stepped out. The doors opened with a mechanical hiss. The interior was calm, bathed in the sterile buzz of overhead lights. A faint pop song trickled out of dusty ceiling speakers. Rows of perfectly arranged shelves stood undisturbed. The air smelled faintly of floor cleaner and plastic wrap. There were only a few people inside. An elderly couple near the back slowly browsed through frozen vegetables. A single young woman stood behind the counter, her blonde hair pulled into a loose ponytail and dark circles under her eyes. She wore a navy sweater and jeans, leaning against the register with a glazed look as she scrolled through her phone. Her name tag read Sarah. Chuck and Steven moved down the beverage aisle, quiet and efficient. As they neared the fridges, Sarah looked up casually, her expression unchanged, until she recognized them. Her eyes widened. She froze mid-swipe. "No way," she whispered, eyes jumping between them. Chuck offered a slight nod. Steven remained silent. You're Chuck Norris and Steven Seagal," she said breathlessly, lowering her phone. "That's insane. I was literally watching Under Siege last night." Steven gave a small nod. "Appreciate the support." Could I get a quick picture?" Sarah fumbled with her phone. "I won't hold you up, promise." Chuck glanced at Stephen, who gave the faintest shrug of agreement. "Sure," Chuck said. "As long as it's quick. We're on a mission for hydration." Sarah stepped around the counter, still nervous, still starstruck. She raised her phone, but her smile faded slightly as she glanced over their shoulders. Outside, beneath the same flickering street lamp, stood 3 men in police uniforms. They weren't approaching casually. They stood still, watching. One was tall and bald, his hand resting too comfortably on the grip of his sidearm. Another was bulky, his posture aggressive, leaning forward slightly. The third, younger and pale, looked like he didn't belong. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing around. Sarah's brow furrowed. Something wasn't right. These weren't cops coming in for coffee. They looked like they were waiting for something, or someone. She tried to shake the feeling, refocused on her phone. "Okay, ready," she said. The doors burst open before the shutter clicked. The 3 uniformed men stormed in, boots heavy against the tile. The tall one, clearly the leader, scanned the store quickly, his eyes sharp and dead. Without hesitation, he marched toward the counter. The bulky one trailed left. The youngest hesitated at the threshold. "Open the register," the leader barked at Sarah. Sarah blinked. What?" "Open it," he snapped, and with a smooth, practiced motion he drew his pistol and aimed it straight at her chest. "Now." Time froze. The elderly couple ducked behind a freezer. A cereal box hit the floor somewhere in the distance. Chuck and Stephen remained still but alert. The calm evaporated. Tension moved in like a storm. Sarah's voice shook. You're police." "Not tonight," the leader growled. 5 seconds, then I paint this floor red." The bulky man loomed closer. "Let's not make this messy, sweetheart," the youngest officer whispered hoarsely from the door. "This isn't how we said we'd do this." "Shut up, Mason," the leader barked. "You want to walk away, you do your part." Stephen took a step forward, slow and deliberate. The leader instantly swung his pistol toward him. "Back off, tough guy." Stephen's voice was low. "You're pointing a weapon at an unarmed woman. You've already lost." Chuck's arms crossed. "You've got 3 seconds to walk out of here, all of you." "Shut it," the leader snapped. Sarah's fingers hovered over the keypad. They trembled too much to press anything. Chuck exhaled. "You know your mistake?" The leader's mouth twitched. "Thinking I care?" "No," Chuck replied evenly. "Thinking we'd let you leave." The tension cracked. The leader's grip faltered, just for a split second. That was enough. Stephen moved. So did Chuck. But what came next would change everything. The moment the leader's wrist twitched, Steven Seagal acted with fluid precision. He stepped inside the arc of the outstretched gun arm, deflecting the weapon upward with a single sweeping motion. His hands moved like water, unpredictable, unstoppable. The pistol fired, but the shot went wild, punching a jagged hole into the ceiling tiles. Dust and plaster rained down. The lights flickered violently, and screams erupted from the far end of the store. Sarah dropped to the floor behind the counter with a sharp gasp. The old couple had already vanished behind a freezer aisle. Chaos was instant, but focused. Chuck Norris lunged forward the moment the gun fired. The bulky man to the left barely had time to draw his baton before Chuck met him mid-step. In one lightning move, Chuck landed a crushing elbow to the side of the man's jaw, followed by a swift spinning kick that knocked the baton across the aisle and sent the attacker crashing into a stack of soda bottles. Plastic hissed, carbonated fizz spraying as bottles burst and rolled away. Stephen twisted the gun from the leader's hand with a final movement that left the man disarmed and bent forward, gasping. The weapon skittered across the floor, sliding beneath the candy rack. The leader tried to retaliate, swinging a fist upward, but Stephen sidestepped, letting the man's momentum carry him into the side of the counter. He grunted, dazed. "Enough," Stephen said, his voice calm, low, final. At the entrance, the youngest man, Mason, stood paralyzed. His gun remained holstered. His hands trembled. His face was pale. He looked like he wanted to disappear. Chuck turned to him, eyes sharp. "Get on the ground." Mason hesitated, glancing at his downed companions. Then, slowly, shakily, he knelt and placed his hands behind his head. The leader wasn't finished. He surged up from the counter, diving toward the register. But Chuck intercepted him with a brutal palm strike to the chest, sending the man crashing backward into a snack display that exploded into a mess of chips and chocolate. The sound of sirens howled outside, growing louder by the second. Someone had triggered the alarm, or maybe the gunshot had done it automatically. Sarah peeked over the edge of the counter, her breathing ragged. Are they done?" Chuck stepped over a fallen can of soup, watching the leader writhe on the ground. "They're done." Stephen retrieved the pistol and carefully ejected the magazine, sliding it across the counter toward Sarah. "Stay behind here," he said. "Police are coming." Lights began flashing through the store windows, red and blue strobes bouncing off the glass doors. Multiple cruisers pulled into the parking lot at once. Real officers moved quickly into formation outside. "Hands in the air," a voice shouted from a loudspeaker. "Everyone down, now." Chuck raised his hands, stepping away from the pile of defeated men. Stephen followed suit. The doors flew open. Real police flooded in, weapons drawn. They quickly assessed the scene. 2 combat legends standing calmly, 3 subdued suspects on the ground, a visibly shaken cashier behind the counter. The response was immediate. Officers rushed in, shouting commands, cuffing the groaning assailants. The leader struggled and spat curses as he was yanked to his feet. "You don't know who I am," he snarled. "You're gonna regret this." "No," Chuck said quietly. "You are." The bulky man groaned as he was rolled over and cuffed, still soaked from spilled soda. Mason didn't resist at all. He knelt quietly, hands still on his head, his eyes wide and hollow. One of the officers, a stocky man with salt and pepper hair and a badge clipped to his belt, stepped forward. "Detective Ramirez," he introduced. "Who called this in?" "I think the system did," Sarah said, still clutching her phone. I didn't move." Ramirez turned to Chuck and Stephen. "You two okay?" "We're fine," Stephen replied. "They're not." Another officer stepped over to the leader, studying his face. "This one's Eric Holt. We know him. Fired 2 months ago. Abuse of power, intimidation, extortion. He's been under investigation ever since." "So he kept the uniform and started robbing stores?" Chuck said, almost to himself. Ramirez nodded. "Looks that way. You guys just ended something we couldn't pin him on before. You have no idea how many small businesses he's shaken down." The store slowly began to settle. Officers escorted the restrained men outside, pushing back curious onlookers who had gathered under the flashing lights. Mason paused at the door, casting one last look at Stephen. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," he muttered. "It wasn't supposed to go like this." Stephen met his gaze. You still chose to be here." Mason looked down and said nothing more. Outside, Holt was still screaming threats as he was forced into the back of a cruiser. Chuck watched silently, his arms crossed. Back inside, Sarah finally emerged from behind the counter. She was trembling, her hands still clutching the edge of the register. Chuck approached her gently. "You okay?" "I think so," she said, her voice cracking. "Thank you. Both of you. I really thought—" Stephen's voice cut in, calm and grounding. "It's over." "No," Holt growled from the doorway as officers pushed him out. "It's not over." Chuck looked at him without blinking. "You're done." The glass doors shut behind him. The noise faded slightly. The room was still a mess, displays overturned, puddles of soda spreading across the floor, the ceiling still leaking plaster from the bullet hole, but the danger was gone. One of the officers approached with a notepad. "We'll need your statements. We've got security footage too, so you won't need to relive everything." "That's good," Chuck said, looking around the wreckage, "because this night's already been long enough." Detective Ramirez offered a short nod. "You two saved lives tonight. And not just hers." Sarah sank onto a nearby stool, still shaking. She stared at the two men like she was trying to make sense of what had just happened. "You're real," she whispered. "I mean, not just from movies. You were here." Stephen gave a faint smile. "Right place, right time." Chuck looked at the shattered cereal boxes on the ground and let out a small sigh. "Guess we'd better start putting this place back together." Sarah blinked. "You're going to help clean?" Chuck looked at her. "We help make the mess." Stephen was already walking toward the fallen soda rack, lifting the heavy metal frame like it was nothing. In the aftermath of fear, the heroes weren't finished. The fight had ended. But the story was far from over. The flashing lights from the cruisers outside had faded into a steady background pulse. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, leaving behind the fatigue of what had almost been a tragedy. The grocery store remained a battlefield of knocked-over shelves, spilled soda, and broken packaging. Yet, among the chaos, two men moved with silent purpose. Chuck Norris was returning dislodged soup cans to a display while Seagal reset the metal rack that had taken the brunt of a flying body earlier. Sarah, the young cashier, sat behind the counter with her head resting in her hands, her phone lying screen up beside her. The photo she had taken just before everything exploded was still open. In it, she stood between two calm titans, both smiling. Now, not 15 minutes later, the same men had stopped an armed robbery with bare hands. The surreal contrast made her shiver. The door opened again, and Detective Ramirez walked in, now without his outer jacket, his badge clipped visibly to his belt. He glanced around the store and nodded slightly at the signs of order being restored. "You two weren't kidding," he said, stopping near the drink aisle. "You really are helping clean up." Chuck wiped his hands on a paper towel and looked up. "We don't leave messes behind." Ramirez offered a faint smile. "Wish more people thought that way." He moved over to the counter where Sarah sat and crouched slightly, softening his voice. "You holding up?" She nodded slowly. "I think so. Still, processing." "That's normal," he said. "You did everything right." "I didn't do anything," she whispered. "I just stood there." Ramirez shook his head. "You didn't run. You didn't freeze. You stayed focused. That's more than most." She looked over at Chuck and Stephen. "They saved me." "They did," Ramirez agreed. "But you still had to live it. That's not easy." Stephen approached quietly. "Fear doesn't make you weak. he said. "It makes you human." Sarah's voice cracked. "I thought I was going to die." "But you didn't," Stephen replied. "And you're still standing. That matters." At the far end of the store, an officer stepped through the doors holding a tablet. He handed it to Ramirez, who reviewed something on the screen with a grim expression. "Thought so," the detective muttered. "The young one, Mason, he's been talking. He's scared out of his mind. Said he thought they were just going to intimidate her. Never expected Holt to draw a weapon." Chuck crossed his arms. "And he still came." Ramirez nodded. "We'll charge him. But he won't go down like Holt will. That man's going away for a long time." "And the third one?" Stephen asked. "Bob Harrison," Ramirez answered. "Known associate of Holt's. Former beat cop turned thug. Lost his badge 2 years ago. Assault complaints, internal affairs investigations. Both of them found each other, looks like." Stephen shook his head. "Power attracts corruption." Sarah finally stood, shaky but upright. "Are they going to come after me now, when they get out?" Ramirez stepped closer. "They won't. We've got enough to hold Holt without bail. Bob, too. As for Mason, he's not your threat. He's barely keeping it together." Chuck added, "They won't touch you. You're safe now." Sarah nodded and reached slowly for her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen before she unlocked it and opened the camera roll. She stared at the photo again, the one she had taken before everything changed. "Do you mind if I post this?" she asked quietly. "I think people should know what happened." Stephen exchanged a glance with Chuck, who shrugged. "Sure," Chuck said. "Just spell our names right." A faint smile touched her lips as she typed out a caption. Within moments, the photo was live. 2 legends flanking a brave, stunned cashier. The likes and shares began rolling in almost immediately. "Looks like it's going viral," Ramirez commented, looking over her shoulder. "Won't be long before the media picks it up." "Let them," Stephen said calmly. "We didn't do this for the cameras." Chuck stepped back from the shelves. "But if it helps others know they can fight back, or at least not give in, then maybe it's worth something." Ramirez looked at both of them. "You two could have walked away when it started. Most people would have." "We've never been most people," Chuck replied. Suddenly, the front door opened again. A man in his 30s with a baseball cap stepped inside, clearly hesitant. He paused as he saw the wreckage and then spotted the 2 martial arts icons standing near the counter. "Excuse me," he said, voice trembling with nerves. Are you really—" "Yes," Stephen said. "I don't want to be a bother," the man said, "but my son's a huge fan of both of you. Can I get a photo? Just one." Chuck looked at the shelves. "Help us restack the soup, and you've got a deal." The man laughed in relief and quickly bent down to assist. Sarah took the photo for him, her hands still slightly unsteady, but her smile more confident now. As the man left, Stephen leaned on the counter, watching the lights outside begin to fade as more cruisers pulled away. "Think that's the end of it?" he asked quietly. Chuck was already resetting the chip rack. "Probably not, but it's the end of tonight." Sarah looked down at her screen. "The post's already got thousands of views. People are calling you heroes." Stephen shrugged. "Tonight, maybe we were." Ramirez nodded in agreement. "The city's going to remember this." And for a moment, the store, despite its mess, felt warm again. Not quiet in the same way, but safer, reclaimed. The storm had passed. and its aftermath was being put back together, one shelf, one word, one act at a time. The stillness inside the supermarket had taken on a different tone. It was no longer the eerie silence that comes before chaos, but the weary quiet that follows it. Cleanup was underway. The damaged soda racks were upright again. The spilled drinks mopped, and scattered chips and candy were slowly returning to their proper places. Outside, the flashing red and blue lights of emergency vehicles dimmed as the last of the cruisers pulled away, leaving behind a parking lot littered with tire tracks and loose debris. Chuck Norris knelt beside a toppled promotional stand near the checkout lane. With slow, deliberate movements, he collected scattered packs of gum and stacked them neatly. Seagal was nearby, gently straightening a metal shelf that had been dented in the fight. Neither man spoke. They worked like monks tending to a temple after a storm. Sarah watched them from behind the counter. Her hands had stopped trembling, but her heart still pounded now and then in unpredictable waves. She couldn't stop glancing up at the ceiling tile with the bullet hole. It seemed unreal, like a leftover detail from a nightmare. And yet, it was there, jagged, blackened, surrounded by a faint sprinkle of plaster dust. Proof that it had all happened. "I still can't believe you're cleaning up," she said finally, her voice soft. Stephen looked over his shoulder. "We made part of the mess." "You saved my life," she said. "You could have walked away and no one would blame you." Chuck stood up and dusted off his jeans. "We don't walk away. Never have." Sarah gave a faint smile. "Most people wouldn't even know what to do. You didn't even hesitate." "That's the thing about danger," Stephen said calmly, walking over to the cooler to grab a bottle of water. "It doesn't wait for hesitation. You move or you don't." Just then, the older man who stocked shelves earlier in the evening reappeared from the back room. His face was pale, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes filled with cautious confusion. "Is it over?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded. "They're gone. Police took them." He looked around at the disheveled store, rubbing the back of his neck. "Guess this shift just got a whole lot longer." Chuck approached and held out a hand. "You all right?" The man hesitated, then took it. "Yeah, I hid. I didn't see most of it. Just heard the shot." Stephen set the water bottle down and returned to the front. "You did the right thing. Staying back probably saved your life." The stockman nodded silently and walked toward the back, his shoulders still tense. Sarah sat on the edge of the counter now, her posture slouched as if the weight of the whole night had finally caught up. She looked down at the photo on her phone again, her, Chuck, Stephen, all smiling in that innocent moment before the door had slammed open and everything had changed. "It's weird," she said. "I used to pretend I was tough. When I was a kid, I'd watch you both on TV and act out fight scenes in the mirror." Chuck smiled faintly. "We all start somewhere." "Tonight, I actually had to be tough," she said, her voice quieter, "and I didn't feel like I was." "You were," Stephen said, "even if it didn't feel like it." She turned her phone around again. The post was blowing up. Thousands of likes, hundreds of shares. People were calling her brave, thanking her for staying calm, calling Chuck and Stephen real-life heroes. Stephen leaned against the counter. "The world's watching now." Sarah gave a small breathy laugh. "I never expected to go viral because of this." Chuck picked up a crushed box of cereal from the floor and tossed it gently into a nearby bin. "No one expects moments like this. They just happen." Sarah blinked. "Do moments like this happen to you often?" Stephen shook his head. Not like this. Just then, Detective Ramirez re-entered the store with a clipboard in one hand and his phone in the other. His expression was more relaxed than earlier, but still sharp with focus. "We've completed preliminary charges," he said, approaching them. "Eric Holt is being held without bail. Too much prior misconduct. We'll build a case off tonight's incident and everything else on his record." "What about the others?" Chuck asked. "Bob Harrison's going to jail too," Ramirez said. "He's got past assaults on file. As for Mason, he looked scared," Stephen interrupted. "He was," Ramirez confirmed. "We've got him in holding. He confessed to everything. Claimed he thought they were just going to intimidate the cashier, maybe get some quick cash. Said he didn't expect the gun to come out." Chuck shook his head. "That's not how crime works. You don't get to pick the ending once you start." "He'll face charges," Ramirez said, "but probably won't see a full sentence. The DA's already looking at a deal if he cooperates and testifies against Holt." "Let's hope he does," Sarah said, "because that man, the leader, he was ready to shoot me." Ramirez looked at her, his tone shifting softer. "You don't have to worry. We've got enough to keep him locked up for a long time." Sarah nodded, exhaling slowly. "Thank you." Ramirez then looked at Chuck and Stephen. "And thank you both again. The city owes you." "We were just here for water," Chuck said. "You left with a criminal takedown and a viral moment," Ramirez replied. "I'd say that's above and beyond." The detective tapped his clipboard once, then turned toward the exit. "We'll follow up with paperwork tomorrow. For now, I think you've done more than enough." Stephen gave a polite nod. "Good night, Detective." As Ramirez left, the store finally began to resemble itself again. Still messy, still imperfect, but intact. Sarah remained behind the counter, now sipping a warm cup of tea she'd made from the break room stash. Her phone buzzed every few seconds. Likes, reposts, comments. She stopped checking them. She looked up at Chuck and Stephen, who were quietly placing the last few items back where they belonged. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked. "For tonight," Chuck said, grabbing a bottle of soda and holding it up like a trophy. "Yeah, it's over." "For good?" Stephen added. "That's a different question." Sarah gave a half smile. "Guess I'll have to wait and see." The door chimed again as another officer entered to retrieve a report from the counter. He gave a respectful nod to the two men, then turned and left. Chuck twisted the cap off the soda bottle and took a long drink. He exhaled afterward, savoring it. "Well," he said, "not exactly the refreshment run we planned." Stephen smirked. "But memorable." The fluorescent lights above flickered once, then steadied. The store was still. The night had changed, and so had they. The cold night air outside was finally settling. The last of the police cruisers had left, and the camera flashes had died down after a brief flurry of local reporters scrambling for statements they wouldn't get. Back inside the store, the damage had been reduced to scattered scuff marks, faint puddles of soda near the refrigerated aisle, and a single bullet hole in the ceiling that still hadn't stopped shedding tiny flakes of plaster. Sarah sat behind the counter again, her shoulders slouched but her eyes more focused now. Her hair was slightly frazzled from the chaos, and she still looked exhausted, but something deeper had shifted. She had survived something violent, something terrifying, and now that it was over, she wasn't broken, just changed. Chuck Norris stood near the snack rack, quietly adjusting a slightly bent shelf arm. He worked slowly, like someone who didn't rush through the small things. Across from him, Steven Seagal lifted a toppled freezer sign and propped it back into place, checking the footing to make sure it wouldn't fall again. "You two don't rest much, do you?" Sarah asked, watching them. Chuck glanced over. "We rest after the work's done." "I mean, it's just chips and candy," she added with a faint smile. Steven looked at her with calm eyes. "Everything's connected. Fixing the little things matters too." Sarah let out a quiet laugh. "You're not like any celebrities I've ever seen. I've had actors throw tantrums over bottled water. You two are putting gum back on shelves." Chuck chuckled. "We're not most actors." She picked up her tea and took another sip. Her phone continued buzzing every few seconds. Her post, featuring the photo of her between the two legends, was now over 30,000 likes and counting. There were comments in every language. People were calling her brave, calling Chuck and Steven saviors and asking for interviews. The surrealism of it hadn't worn off. Not yet. The door opened again. Detective Ramirez returned, notepad in hand, his expression focused. He paused just inside, observing the almost repaired store. "You two never stop," he said, walking over. Steven looked up. "Still standing." Ramirez nodded, then flipped a page in his notepad. "We've completed the interviews. Surveillance footage matches the witness reports. Your actions were clear and justified." Chuck stepped away from the shelf. "What about Holt? He's screaming and holding. Still thinks he's untouchable. But the evidence is overwhelming," Ramirez said. "He's going to be arraigned in the morning and will push for no bail. The DA is already building a case around this night, and your presence makes it hard for anyone to spin it." "What about Mason?" Steven asked. Ramirez flipped to another page. "He gave a full statement. Said Holt promised it would be easy. No one would get hurt. They'd just scare her and leave. But he admitted he froze when the gun came out." "He still showed up," Chuck said. "Agreed," Ramirez replied. "He'll face charges, but he's cooperating, and that'll count for something." Sarah folded her arms on the counter. "He didn't pull his weapon, I remember. He looked like he wanted to disappear." "That's what may save him," Ramirez said. "But he won't walk away free." The detective paused and lowered his voice. "Holt has done this before. We've got older reports from other stores. Managers who refused to talk. Some paid him off to avoid trouble. We never had enough to take him down." "Until tonight," Steven said. Ramirez nodded. "Until tonight." There was a silence, not uncomfortable, just heavy with meaning. Sarah sat forward. "Am I going to have to testify?" Ramirez turned to her, his voice reassuring. "Eventually, yes. But you won't be alone. And after tonight's footage, it'll be an open and shut case. You did everything you could." "I didn't even press the alarm," she admitted quietly. "I couldn't move." "But someone must have called," Chuck said. "Or maybe the system's gunshot detector did," Ramirez added. "Either way, help came fast, faster than usual. Might be luck, or maybe something else." Steven's gaze lingered on Sarah for a moment. "The important thing is that you're still here." She nodded slowly. "I was terrified." Chuck approached the counter. "That's what courage is, being terrified, and staying anyway." Ramirez scribbled something into his notepad, then tucked it under his arm. "You'll get a call from the department in a few days. In the meantime, there will probably be press. The story's already being picked up by national outlets." "I've seen it," Sarah said, tapping her phone screen. "People are posting from everywhere. which means Holt will try to twist it," Ramirez added, "but it won't help him." He turned toward the door again. "We'll handle the rest. Thank you both, again." With that, he left the store, leaving behind only the soft ding of the door chime. For a moment, all was quiet again. Chuck wandered over to the drink cooler and pulled out a lemon soda. He twisted the cap, took a long sip, and leaned against the freezer. "Well," he said, "not what I expected when we left the gym." "No," Stephen replied, "but not the worst night either." Sarah was still staring at her screen. "I think I'm starting to realize just how bad it could have been." Stephen approached slowly. But it wasn't, because the right people were in the right place. She looked up at them again. "Thank you." "You held up better than most," Chuck said. "I didn't feel like I did," she admitted. "I was frozen. I couldn't even scream." "But you didn't run," Stephen said. "You didn't make it worse, and that counts." Sarah stood slowly and looked out toward the front of the store where the chaos had first erupted. She took in the scattered remnants of what had been a battlefield, now calm, quiet, even somewhat clean. "I don't think I'll ever forget this night," she whispered. Chuck placed the soda bottle on the counter. "Neither will we." Stephen nodded in agreement. "Some nights don't fade." And then, without needing to say more, they returned to work, quietly resetting what was left. Outside, the world continued unaware that 3 criminals had almost torn apart a life and a place, but were stopped by 2 men who had come in for nothing more than a cold drink and walked into a storm they never expected, and chose to stand anyway. The last hours of the night passed in a slow, heavy silence. It was almost 2:30 a.m. The once chaotic supermarket was mostly back in order. Shelves restacked, the sticky soda cleaned up, and even the dented freezer sign straightened and taped in place. Only 2 things hadn't been touched: the bullet hole in the ceiling and the atmosphere. That kind of disturbance doesn't disappear with a mop. Behind the counter, Sarah sat again, sipping what was left of her tea. It had gone cold, but she didn't mind. Her phone buzzed endlessly beside her. She had turned the volume off after the 100th notification. News outlets had started sharing her photo. Blogs, fan pages, even local TV stations were reposting the image of her flanked by Chuck Norris and Seagal, both of them calm and stoic, unaware of what was about to happen just minutes later. Stephen stood quietly near the magazine rack, eyes scanning the headlines without reading them. Chuck was leaned against the counter beside her, arms crossed, staring at the shattered tile above. "I never thought I'd see something like that," Sarah said softly, nodding at the ceiling. Chuck didn't respond at first. Then, "Neither did I. Not here, not tonight." Stephen finally spoke. "Danger never sends a warning." She glanced at them. "Do things like this happen to you often?" Stephen shook his head. "Not like this. Not in a place where people come for eggs and milk." Chuck added, "Fights, sure. Threats. But this was a different kind of wrong. A man with a badge, using it to hurt people. That's betrayal." The front doors opened again, and a familiar voice cut through the silence. "I figured you 2 might still be here." Detective Ramirez stepped in, now in a plain dark shirt and jeans. His badge was still clipped to his hip, and his face looked even more tired than earlier. He walked with a slow, deliberate pace and carried a tablet under one arm. Sarah straightened. "Did something happen?" "No," Ramirez said. "I just wanted to follow up before heading home. Didn't feel right leaving things where we left off." He placed the tablet on the counter and tapped the screen. Footage from the incident played silently. Holt drawing his weapon. Chuck's movement. The wild shot into the ceiling. Stephen's disarm. Sarah watched with wide eyes, even though she'd lived through it. Evidence like this, Ramirez said, means Holt won't talk his way out. The DA's going to throw everything at him. What about Bob? Chuck asked. Charged with assault, impersonating a peace officer, conspiracy to commit armed robbery. He'll be out of circulation for a while, Ramirez said. Mason will likely testify. He's shaken up, but he's talking. He admitted everything. Stephen crossed his arms. He's lucky he didn't get anyone killed. He knows, Ramirez replied. He said he thought Holt would just scare her. He claims he didn't know about the gun. Sarah looked down at the counter. That's not an excuse. No, Ramirez agreed, but it might be the truth. He was in way over his head. There was a pause. Then Sarah asked the question that had been sitting in her chest for the last hour. Will I be safe if they ever get out? Ramirez's eyes locked onto hers. You will. Holt isn't getting out. Not soon, not quietly, and we'll have officers keep an eye on this place for a while. You won't be alone. She let out a slow breath. Okay. Stephen looked at Ramirez. And after tonight? We'll put it in the report, the detective said. Footage backs everything up. Your involvement won't be questioned. Chuck tilted his head. We're not worried about the report. Ramirez nodded, understanding. Then I'll say this. Whatever brought you here tonight, I'm glad it did. He tapped the tablet off and tucked it under his arm again. As he turned to leave, Sarah called out, Wait. He paused. Do I have to testify? She asked. Eventually, Ramirez said, not alone and not anytime soon. The system moves slow, but it's moving. She nodded. Okay. The detective gave a small wave, then disappeared through the doors once more. The hum of the lights overhead returned to prominence. Chuck grabbed another bottle of lemon soda and opened it, taking a long drink. Stephen leaned back against the counter. You know, Sarah said quietly, when I was younger, I used to pretend I was brave. I'd watch movies with you guys in them and imagine I was the one doing the saving, but tonight, I didn't feel brave. Chuck looked at her with steady eyes. You didn't run. That's braver than most. I felt frozen. Stephen replied, That's fear. It slows everything down. Doesn't mean you failed. Sarah looked at the photo again. She hadn't posted since the first one, but now it had over 50,000 likes. Comments flowed in from around the world, people saying she was courageous, that the story inspired them, that Chuck and Stephen were legends in real life. It still doesn't feel real, she whispered. It was real, Stephen said, and it mattered. Chuck leaned closer. What you lived through, that changes people, but it doesn't break them. You're still standing. That's what matters. Sarah nodded, blinking fast to hold back the weight of her emotions. Thank you, both of you. Any time, Chuck said. At the front of the store, the automatic doors slid open once again. A man in his 30s, wearing a baseball cap and holding the hand of a small girl, entered hesitantly. Excuse me, he said. Sorry to interrupt, but are you really Chuck Norris and Steven Seagal? The girl's eyes went wide with awe as she looked at them. Stephen exchanged a glance with Chuck, then gave the smallest nod. Would you mind a picture? The father asked. She's a huge fan. And, well, we saw the story online. Chuck gave a small smile. Only if you help us fix the soup shelf afterward. The man laughed, relieved. Deal. Sarah stood up and took the photo herself, this time steady-handed. The flash lit up the store for just a second. As the father and daughter left, Sarah looked at the two men who had saved her and quietly helped her put her world back together. "You two ever get tired of being heroes?" she asked. Stephen looked at her. "We're not heroes," Chuck added. "We're just men who made a choice." She smiled. "You made the right one." The clock behind her showed nearly 3 o'clock a.m., the end of a long, unimaginable night. Chuck turned to Stephen. "Time to head out?" Stephen nodded. "Yeah, we've done our good deed for the week." Sarah walked them to the doors, her steps lighter now. As they stepped out into the cool night air, she called after them, "Take care of yourselves." Chuck turned. "You too, and maybe install that panic button closer to the counter." She laughed for real this time. "I will." The doors slid closed behind them. The two men walked toward their SUV. The parking lot was quiet again, the chaos of earlier now a memory imprinted in the cool asphalt and faint tire marks. As they got in and closed the doors, neither spoke for a moment. Then Stephen said, "So, pancakes next time?" Chuck looked over. "Yeah, pancakes sound good." They drove off, the supermarket fading behind them. Inside, Sarah returned to the counter. The bullet hole was still there, but the fear had faded. In its place was something new, strength, and one incredible story she would carry for the rest of her life. The SUV rolled steadily through the quiet streets, its headlights slicing through the misty pre-dawn air. Inside, the mood had settled into something reflective, even peaceful. Chuck Norris was behind the wheel, hands relaxed, gaze focused. In the passenger seat, Steven Seagal leaned against the window, his eyes following the blur of streetlights and shuttered storefronts. The storm was over, but its weight lingered. Neither man had spoken since they pulled out of the supermarket parking lot. It wasn't the silence of discomfort. It was the kind of silence that only came after surviving something sharp, dangerous, and real. They had been in 1,000 situations in film and training, in controlled chaos and choreographed fights. But tonight had been something else. No cameras, no second takes, just a bad man with a gun and a choice they had to make. Stephen finally broke the silence. "You ever wonder what would have happened if we'd been 5 minutes later?" Chuck didn't take his eyes off the road. "I don't have to wonder. I know." "She would have been alone," Stephen said. "No backup, no help, just a trigger and a man with nothing to lose." Chuck nodded once. "And she'd be another name in a news ticker." They passed a diner on the corner, closed, dark, its flickering neon sign sputtering half a letter. Stephen glanced at it. "You remember that place?" he asked. "We used to stop there after shoots." Chuck gave a faint smile. "Late nights, bad coffee, best pie in the county." "We should go back sometime," Stephen muttered. "Next time we're not disarming felons," Chuck agreed. The road ahead was open, the traffic lights cycling green with no cars to interrupt. The city was asleep again. But both men knew that tonight something had cracked under the surface. An ex-cop with a badge he didn't deserve had nearly killed someone. And the system hadn't stopped him. They had. Stephen rubbed his jaw, then looked over. "Do you think she'll be okay?" Chuck took a moment. "In time, she'll wake up shaken. She'll hear sounds differently, but she'll heal." "Not everyone does," Stephen said. "No," Chuck agreed, "but she's strong. You saw it." Stephen nodded. "She reminded me of a woman I met overseas. Gun to her head, trembling, but didn't flinch. Some people have that." "She didn't know she had it until she needed it," Chuck said. They drove in silence again for several blocks. The city began to thin out. Fewer buildings, more open spaces. The hotel was near. Stephen looked at his phone. Sarah's post had passed 100,000 likes. There were international outlets picking up the story now. Calls for awards, interviews, even hashtags trending worldwide. "We're viral," he muttered. Chuck scoffed lightly. "Not why we did it." "But it's what people will remember," Stephen said. Chuck nodded. "Good. Let them remember. Maybe next time, someone else will step up." Stephen put the phone away. "Feels strange. Spent my life playing the hero, but tonight, it was real." "You were the hero," Chuck said. "So was she." Stephen looked over. "You were too." Chuck gave a dry smirk. "You're getting sentimental." Stephen chuckled. "Don't get used to it." They reached the hotel lot and pulled in. The building was quiet, most rooms dark. A single lobby light flickered behind the glass entrance. Chuck, parked under a tree, cut the engine. For a moment, neither moved. "You think we were meant to be there?" Stephen asked. Chuck stared ahead. "Yeah, I do." "Not chance? Not luck?" "No," Chuck said. "Sometimes life puts you where you're needed, whether you like it or not." Stephen exhaled. "We didn't walk away." Chuck looked over. "We never do." They stepped out of the SUV, stretching slightly in the cool air. The night had stretched long, but it was finally starting to give way to dawn. Faint blue crept over the horizon. As they walked toward the hotel doors, Stephen said, "So what happens next?" Chuck shrugged. "We go back to training, back to work. But this night stays with us." Stephen nodded. "It should." The glass doors slid open. The lobby was empty. The night clerk didn't look up from his magazine. They passed through without a word. Back at the supermarket, the lights had dimmed to their default overnight setting. Sarah sat alone behind the counter, her phone now dark, finally silenced. She had cleaned the last of the visible mess herself. The place looked normal again, at a glance. But she knew better. She looked up at the ceiling, at the hole left by Holt's bullet. They'd patch it soon, just drywall and paint. But the memory of that sound, the sharp crack, the dust in the air, the look in Holt's eyes, those things wouldn't vanish with repairs. And yet, she didn't feel broken anymore. She felt awake. She picked up her phone and opened the photo one more time. Her, Chuck, Stephen. Moments before the world tipped sideways. A smile played on her lips, not because it was over, but because she had survived it. She locked the screen, set the phone down, and leaned back. For her, this night had changed everything. For Chuck Norris and Steven Seagal, it had been another fight, another stand, another moment to do what was right. And, like all true heroes, they hadn't hesitated. They had just answered the call, and then walked quietly back into the night. Stories like this can happen when you least expect it. What would you have done? Let us know where you're watching from. It really matters to us. Like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you don't miss what's coming next. This is just the beginning.